part of the reason why folks have been able to retain this illusion of a multipolar world or an even playing field is because the United States has scrupulously maintained that for more positive reasons, to sort of give other countries the self-respect and the ability to compete on some playing fields. I think there's less and less of that.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray McElhone. I do all the podcasty stuff, and I'm with our political philosophizer, Robert Morris.
Hey, Rory, how's it going?
Things are going very well, and before we started recording, I wasn't procrastinating by watching an episode of Map Men on YouTube as they talked about country domains. And they pointed out that there aren't that many .us's used. And do you know why that is, Rob?
I don't know. Why?
Because Americans just assume they own the internet and .com is what they use. They don't need none of this stuffy pretext .de or whatever.
Oh, interesting. That is a great introduction to what I want to talk about today.
You wouldn't have any opinions on such a topic?
I do have some opinions, Rory, and I am a bit concerned that I'm sort of turning into a broken record, just sort of talking about U.S. power all the time. But I do think that it's important to even dedicate a whole episode to just a basic fact that doesn't get said enough, which is that the United States runs the world. Like, we are in charge. And I don't say that from a perspective of woohoo, USA, we're in charge, but actually from a place of almost shame, because I think that we hide the ball. I think that we lie about this, frankly, and pretend, not in every context, but in enough contexts, we pretend that, oh, no, we're just a competitor, one country among other countries. And to some extent, that can be good. That can be a valuable part of public diplomacy and just not seeming like arrogant a-holes all the time. But it can be quite pernicious as well, because it pretends that we don't have power to do things. And more importantly, we don't have power to stop things that we absolutely have the power to stop. It becomes this mythology that we're in some kind of strategic competition with the Chinese or the Russians that justifies behaving in certain ways, or, we have no choice. The fact, Rory, is that the United States always has a choice. The only real limitations on the United States are U.S. domestic politics. However, actors within U.S. domestic politics love to pretend that the Chinese or the Russians or maybe even the Indians, that'll be a growing factor, I think, are stealing a march on us. And it's essential that we do this thing or that thing, or sanction this person, or we have to keep supporting Saudi.
You're not allowed food stamps anymore.
Yeah, have to keep supporting Saudi Arabia, or have to cut Medicare, or have to cut Social Security because it's so hard out here being the United States. And it's just nonsense. And I think that it's important to have a full episode focused on that dynamic, because it isn't said enough that the United States runs the world. And I was inspired by this. We're not going to do a full-on paragraph by paragraph read on this, but I was inspired by a recent article in The Guardian that is an excerpt of a book by Tom Stevenson that I've purchased. I like this article so much, but I have not read it yet. But this Guardian article is called "America's Undying Empire: Why the Decline of U.S. Power Has Been Greatly Exaggerated." And there's just a paragraph, I think there's a couple paragraphs I'd like to read. The first one is, I think, this. This is Tom Stevens writing in The Guardian, starting a quote now. I've become very sensitive about the the question of plagiarism.
Oh yes, have you watched the H Bomber guy video?
Yeah, I've been watching that. That is not a it's not a video that you watch in one sitting. But
Sadly, I did.
So,
But anyway, that's a different story.
well, maybe that's a testament to your stick-to-itiveness and task.
I was waiting to get fiber optic, and they basically said my pole was too dangerous, so they had to come back another day.
So anyway, there's been a very popular YouTube video for those who are less internet poisoned than the two of us, talking about the issues of plagiarism.
And the internet historian is in the crosshairs.
Indeed.
Well, he's like the warm-up act for the main event.
Indeed. But
it does make just to talk about that a wee bit, it does seem like, the likes of YouTube and that needed a little bit of maturing just to basically go, this is how you reference. We don't mind if you do it. If you just read Wikipedia, that's fine. We're kind of happy with that. Just let us all know.
Yeah, this H Bomber guy found some really egregious examples. And I think watching the video, I don't feel like I've ever really strayed, but I do want to just really emphasize that this paragraph I'm about to read comes from Tom Stevenson in The Guardian, an article I just whose title I just read to you. So, beginning the quote.
Well, if you watch the videos, you'll notice Rob will hold up the book. So, we were referencing before. It was cool.
Yeah, yes, indeed. So this is the quote. Yet the shadow American power still casts over the rest of the world is unmistakable. The U.S. has military superiority over all other countries. Control of the world's oceans via critical sea lanes, garrisons on every continent, a network of alliances that covers much of the industrial world, the ability to render individuals to secret prisons in countries from Cuba to Thailand, preponderant influence over the global financial system, about 30% of the world's wealth, and a continental economy not dependent on international trade. And as I've emphasized in recent episodes, especially the one on the book Underground Empire, is that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the elements of power and influence that the United States has to draw upon. And I'm not sure, this is an analogy I've been thinking about a lot recently, and it's obviously in the context of Israel-Gaza. It applies to a lot of things that the United States has done. We've seen this to an absurd extent in the 2 months that Israel and the United States have been obliterating Gaza. This is a standard argumentative approach. It's like, why do you care so much about what Israel and the United States are doing? Why don't there's terrible things happening in Sudan. There's terrible things happening in Ethiopia. And don't get me started on the Congo. Why are you complaining about what Israel and the United States does? And this is this analogy that's been reverberating through my head. I'd like to preemptively apologize. You can construe this in a lot of really horrible ways. But say you're in a nursery school and 2 3-year-olds in a nursery school get in a fight and one of them loses an eye. That's terrible. That's horrible. We should do everything we can to keep 3-year-olds from fighting and ripping their eyes out. But compare that to a nursery school where the teacher decides to kick a 3-year-old's face in. These are not the same situation. This is not a morally equivalent issue. You can't say when the 35-year-old nursery school teacher decides to kick in a 3-year-old's head, you can't say, well, 2 weeks ago, some 3-year-olds were fighting and one of them ripped their eyeball out. That is not an adequate defense here. And I think that while I think the very problematic nature of this analogy is comparing what's going on in Sudan or Ethiopia to,
countries to children.
To countries to children, that's very problematic. I apologize, what have you. But I do think that the power differential that I'm talking about here with the United States, with what the United States chooses to do.
Well, I would say it seems to be the difference between warm-blooded murder to cold-blooded. A lot of what America does just seems very cold and calculating, and I can just imagine an office that you'd picture in Office Space, and they're all just agreeing about doing horrendous things around the world, while something like Sudan feels like a sort of a horrible maelstrom that's been ebbing away for decades, that it's almost as if like you're stuck in molasses. You don't have as much agency as, corporate types in America.
I have no sympathy for Hemeti or Burhan, the two
Oh, yes,
guys
yes.
in Sudan, but it's important to point out that both Hemeti and Burhan are fighting for their lives. One of them's going to win.
Oh,
One of
yeah.
them's going to
Whoever
lose.
loses is not going to live.
And the other guy, one guy gets Sudan, the other guy gets, if he's lucky, somewhat cleanly shot up against the wall. The United States always has a choice. The United States is always choosing whether or not. That is a great analogy, Rory. It is the United States always gets to decide to do things. And that's especially when we consider, I'm not just talking about Sudan and Ethiopia when I'm using that elementary school teacher versus 3-year-old analogy. I'm also talking about Russia and China. It really is like, was that some comedy of the 1990s? It really is. Was it Election? Was it Matthew Broderick and Reese Witherspoon? It's where a high school teacher has a vendetta against a high school student. That is kind of the way that I look at U.S. competition with Russia and China. There is no real competition here. These are choices that the United States has made, and it's just really important to emphasize that. I may sound like a broken record here, but it's just, these are all choices that the United States makes, and they are perverse choices when you consider that the United States runs the world. I think with China in particular, I think it makes sense to bring up an example at this point that just sort of highlights that, because China would be, it's really the only, I think I've referred to it in the past, as the only other country in the world that has any sovereignty at all. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a very interesting piece of legislation that I believe was enacted in 2022. This, of course, is dealing with Xinjiang. I don't generally call it the Xinjiang genocide, just as I don't yet refer to what is happening in Gaza as genocide, though I will say that what's happening in Gaza is a hell of a lot more genocidal than what is happening in Xinjiang. No question, however, that what the Chinese are doing in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is absolutely unforgivable, inappropriate. This is actually a case where I believe sanctions are to some degree justified. What China is doing is this is for sure. This is from Chinese resources, not like somewhat delusional Christian fanatics that seem to be guiding a lot of the Xinjiang genocide stuff. The Chinese government has confirmed that it has put 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. So this is illegitimate. In 2022, the United States enacted a law, the UFLPA for short, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that basically says that nothing is allowed into the United States that has been produced in this region or has been produced at any level of production has been produced by slave labor. Because that is, I think, indisputable and to some extent confirmed by the Chinese government as well, that there are forced labor aspects to these concentration camps. And I think the U.S. government has entirely appropriately said, we are not going to allow you to sell anything that has been produced with slave labor. So what this necessitates, this UFLPA, it means that every Chinese company that wants to export something to the United States, and every Chinese company, with very few exceptions, wants to export things to the United States, has to become an expert in UFLPA compliance. This means that there are businesses within China that are oriented around making sure that you can certify that certain Chinese goods are not manufactured in certain parts of China so that they can be sold to the United States. There really are, there are inspectors going through Chinese factories to make sure that Chinese goods are in compliance with U.S. law. And this is the only other sovereign country in the world. Like, this is the country with the most independence from the United States. How does that sound to you, Rory? Does that is it crazy to describe that as not, like, it's not a free country. It's not an independent country. This is not a relationship of equals. Does that seem crazy to describe?
Definitely
that way,
not as much as it, I guess, would have thought maybe in the 90s that this was going to be. It sort of thought, oh, we'll do our thing, you do your thing, and America's basically says, no, you'll do what we want you to do.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like, this is a rare piece of U.S. sanctions legislation that I'm sure if I read the legislation and spent 2 hours reading about the implementation, I'm sure I'd find things to object to. But in principle and the basics here, I think this is worthwhile. I think this is the right thing to do. But what it means in practice is that supposedly our biggest rival has, can't sell anything abroad unless it certifies compliance with U.S. law. And that's just one.
Do you want to hear a second thing that shows just how far ahead America is?
Absolutely. That's what we're doing here today.
You know how we're hearing about all these other scary missiles and planes and stuff other countries have? Of the 10 top air forces in the world, America has 4 of them.
Has 4 of them? How does that work?
Well, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps.
Oh, jeez, man! I thought you were going to be like, oh, well, Britain and France are in NATO or something. But
if you consider them individual, oh yeah, well, they have more than most of these other countries.
That's crazy.
So if you were to split them as treat them as a country, so that's just how far ahead America is.
But the PLA must, so like the People's Liberation Army counted as one? Like,
oh yeah, they're in the top 10,
They're in the top 10. They're not like...
Oh yeah,
but
yeah. If you combine... But after that, as I say, America is in the top 10 4 times.
4 times, yeah. No, that it is.
So yeah, you'll have your big hitters, but it drops off pretty quick.
Yeah, the military dominance is just on a... It's funny, Rory, they especially, less so now, but a decade ago, there was this incredible vogue for describing the world we live in now as strikingly reminiscent of the period leading up to World War I. And it's just like, no, it isn't. just in terms of
sadly
pure
with history is you can find whatever part you want to, put whatever opinion across. Because I know there's a famous article. It's basically saying, like, it's maybe a month or 2 before World War I breaks out, and it says, oh, with so much capital and so much markets going, against with all these countries like France and Germany, there's never going to be a big war. And that's always used as, oh, that's exactly like we are now. But you can just find whatever you want.
It was a book, Rory. It was called The Grand Illusion by, I think it was The Grand Illusion. Don't go over it, but I do know the name was Norman Angell. And did I read the whole thing? And what was fascinating reading that book is it was absolutely correct. I think he did go so far as to say there won't be a war. But what he said was there won't be a war because if there were a war, it would be so catastrophic, it would end European world dominance and end most, if not all, European countries as going concerns. And that's exactly what happened. The Ottomans, the Austrians, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, all disappeared because of that war. The United States did manage to preserve the French and British empires for another couple decades. So Norman Angell was right about that. But to the point I was making and the point you were making, it's just like this idea that there's some kind of balance of military forces, as there was in land forces in the run-up to World War I. It's ludicrous when, as you pointed out, that the U.S. military is 4 of the top 10 air forces. And then so that's 4, and then the other 4, that round out the top 10 are all U.S. allies.
Well, would be
except for Russia and China.
Royal Air Force, Saudi Arabia, Japan, India, China, Korea, and Russia.
Oh, wow. India. No, I don't think I would... India's got that large an air force already. That's surprising to me. But regardless, the United States is just so absurdly dominant. The other example I wanted to go into that Uyghur, it's, in my defense, in Turkish, I believe it is pronounced Uyghur, but Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but also the JCPOA. This is an old hobby horse that I'm going to have to let go because the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, is in fact quite dead. And it was one of the most one-sided arms control deals in human history. It is so... I've recently gotten very lucky on YouTube. Video that I did on Peter Zeihan did very, very, very well. It's actually November, Rory, was my best month on YouTube ever, which is...
I think it's all down to me.
The best month in 5 years. I agree. It's mostly down to the podcast and Rory, for sure. But this video did very well, and I had a lot of people coming in, and there's a throwaway line in that video where I talk about how great the Iran nuclear deal was. And it was just fascinating to me that so many people saw that as instantly disqualified. Well, I got to minute 10, and then you said the Iran nuclear deal was a good deal, and I said, oh, you're dumb, and left. And I was just like, how did that become so ingrained? Because it was an extraordinary deal. Like, the very nature of this deal is I think a conclusive argument to any suggestion that there is a real competition between Iran and the United States. It was absurd. Iran had to give up an incredible amount of things, had to submit itself to incredibly intrusive inspections by an international bureaucracy that was essentially doing U.S. bidding for nothing, for the removal, for essentially the United States said, we'll allow you to be a country. And the amazing thing, Rory, is that we didn't even commit to lifting all the sanctions we had on Iran. We just said, we'll let you trade with other countries.
A little bit.
We'll let you access your money in return for you submitting to these incredibly invasive inspections for a decade. It's so incredibly one-sided, and it's nobody just steps back and looks at how insane it is that Iran is described as a strategic competitor to the United States when this is a deal that the Iranians submitted to, complied with, according to people who hate Iran with every fiber of their body, like Jim Mattis, the Trump Secretary of Defense. Yes, they were complying. They were doing what they said they would do. Extraordinarily one-sided. And then the United States pissed it away. And the amazing thing is the United States broke this deal, and for at least a year, I think almost 2 years, Iran continued to comply with the deal just for the chance to do a little bit of business with some European allies of the United States. And it was only when Israel started assassinating retired scientists in Iran that Iran finally started backing off from the deal a bit. And this is really key. The IAEA inspectors are still present in Iran. They're still, I think it's the International Atomic Energy Agency or Association or something. They're still inspecting Iranian sites because there's other aspects and other deals and other sanctions things that Iran is subject to. And it's extraordinary. Iran, I believe, throughout this process has been a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the United States is not a signatory to, I believe. Don't quote me on that.
All because of Star Wars, allegedly.
Yeah, it's just, it's extraordinary what is just expected. And, the random YouTube commenter will be like, oh, this is a terrible, terrible deal for the United States. No, it's a terrible, humiliating, offensive deal to the detriment of Iran. is what it was. And the United States threw it away because really no reasons other than domestic politics.
It's also the fact it felt just like a whim.
Yeah.
And it's the fact America doesn't really get that much kickback.
No. What's
When you
happening in
consider how
Gaza?
disastrous things are in Iran at the moment compared to America, was just like, well, this didn't work out.
Yep. And we're just going to continue starving this country to death. And we're just going to continue starving Syria to death. And we're just going to continue. The bombing in Gaza is horrific. I think I've made it pretty clear how I feel about that. But again, like, we are in violation of every humanitarian standard. We are in violation of everything we've said and accused anybody of. If what Russia's been doing to Ukraine is genocide, and if what China's been doing to the Uyghurs is genocide, then what we're doing in Gaza is definitely genocide. And it just, like, I have been surprised by how little pushback there has been to Israel's essentially extermination program in Gaza. Every Arab country has said, oh, geez, this is terrible. I guess we're not going to do a deal on visa-free travel with Israel for another 6 months. I don't think anyone's... Well, actually, they might have been doing visa-free travel. Iran, I was very, very concerned in the initial weeks of this extermination program in Gaza that Iran was going to back up all its strong words about solidarity with the Palestinians, and Hezbollah was going to jump in and we were going to get a regional war. And Iran's just sort of like, no, sorry. We don't, sorry. So it really is, it's almost like that moment when you expect the professional wrestlers in the United States to actually start really fighting. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Like, we're friends. We all work together here. And that's kind of like, Iran has gets a lot of mileage, just as the Pentagon and U.S. defense budgets get a lot of mileage out of this rivalry. But when the rubber's hitting the road and the things that they actually claim to be standing up for are like the continued existence of the Palestinian people in Gaza are under threat, they're like, hey, let's back off a second here. And it's not a real fight either. So it's just,
are we seeing America just sort of, I don't know, true self exposed with Israel, Gaza?
God, I hope not, Rory. It's just, God, I hope not. I think what we're seeing is a lot of pathologies working their way through. I think that Netanyahu is first and foremost a servant of the U.S. military-industrial complex. I think that what we're seeing is that the reflexes of Washington, D.C., Israel must defend itself. I think a lot of people are seeing that as some kind of shameful subservience to the wiles of the IPAC or the Israel lobby or something like that. And no, Israel must defend itself means that Raytheon must get more money. It's really about just how subservient Israel has become to the interests of U.S. defense companies. Israel, I don't believe, is yet prepared to commit genocide. Genocide is the only military solution to Hamas. Yet Israel is doing nothing other than bombing Gaza at this point, somehow hoping that there'll be a positive result. And I believe that that's a situation that is persisting.
And now they're bombing the part they told everyone to go to. So it's just a full bombing of the entire region.
They started the war drawing a line across Gaza. They said, well, if you got to go south because we're coming in and taking everything in the north. They polarized that. Now they're saying, okay, now we're going to do the south. There is nowhere where Gazans are allowed to live unmolested and unbombed. It is the greatest horror of the century. Not just because of that analogy, the 3-year-old scratching an eye out versus the elementary school teacher kicking a 3-year-old's face in, not just because of that analogy, but also in raw numbers. It's getting to the point where it's the greatest atrocity of this century thus far. But it's not. I don't think it's not because Netanyahu is sinister and clever, or the Likud party or the IPAC. It's because Israeli politics have been cheapened and denigrated to such an extent that it's just a shell for selling U.S. weapons. And I think that the knee-jerk reflexes of the Washington, D.C. establishment and their interactions with various Israel lobbies and weapons lobbies are also sort of being shown to just be this like knee-jerk. It's foul. I mean, the only way to describe it is quite foul, but it's not even so noble as to be for the preservation of the Israeli state and a safe place for the Jewish people. As wrong as that might be from the perspective of some, that's a noble pursuit, far nobler than what's actually going on here, which is just a way to make money for Raytheon.
Much more dangerous for Jewish people that don't live in Israel. Like, I remember you were talking about how Ukraine was incredibly anti-Semitic, but I think one of the groups to suffer the most violence from hate crime in America are Jewish people. And that's when something like this isn't going on. So this is, something that will be thrust upon them that they'd have essentially nothing to do with. So if you really wanted the best for Jewish people, you probably wouldn't be enabling horrific acts like this.
Yeah, that's the really horrific. One of the most outrageous things is that there was recently a piece of legislation passed in the U.S. Congress, largely toothless, but sort of asserting that, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitism. What it's essentially saying is criticism because the state of Israel has been reduced to a bomb-selling program I guess it's, I keep saying Raytheon. Apparently Raytheon no longer exists, because the brand got so toxic. It's now RTX Technologies or something.
Like Blackwater?
But RTX Technologies, Northrop Grumman, like, that's what they're saying. They're basically saying, criticizing this shell that's designed to sell weapons is anti-Semitism now, which is beyond outrageous. But yeah, it's just, we are so much more powerful. And when I bring this up, people are like, why are you so anti-America? I am not anti-America. Like, I am for reality about America. Like, we are in charge. What's the classic Stuart Brand line? They're like, we are as gods and we should start acting like it. Like, it's just, we must, like, there's basic responsibility. Stuart Brand to Spider-Man, with great power comes responsibility, and we're not exercising any. We're doing everything in our power to deny responsibility and to pretend we don't live in the world that we live in, that we created.
What would be the greatest defense for America acting this way? Is this the sort of thing, if Americans don't have these distractions, that they'll turn on each other? Or there's powerful entities within America that would then, fight amongst each other. What is the greatest sort of reasoning for this?
Greatest reasoning for this? I think there's a lot of folks some people I respect on domestic policy who are in love with this idea that we need international competition to do anything worthwhile in the United States. I think it's a very persuasive argument that the only reason got as far as we have gotten on civil rights, the rights of African Americans, is because we were sick of the Soviets talking about it. Because it was hurting us with all the newly independent countries we wanted to have trade relations with in the context of the Cold War. So I think a lot of people believe that the United States needs some kind of competition to make any positive changes to itself. I'm not sure that's the case. I hope that's not the case. Do we really need to foster this culture that slaughters Palestinian children by the thousand to make any positive changes in the United States? I really hope not, Murray. I really hope not. I don't think that's the case, but that is I think, the argument. That is the spoken and unspoken approach of a lot of folks in the United States.
Do you think there's much of a grand strategy, or is it a lot of bumbling about and people trying to make a quick buck in this country and that country and so on?
I think it's a lot of bumbling about. It's mostly greed and stupidity. That's sort of one of my most convinced analytical tools or maxims with which I understand the world is there a conspiracy there, or is there just a lot of greed and stupidity? And I think generally it's greed and stupidity. Yeah, it's greed and stupidity. What's, I think, interesting is that we do, sound a little Trumpian here, or actually very, very Biden and the foreign policy for the middle class here. Trumpian in rhetoric and Biden-ish in action. But we do make ourselves weaker in certain ways in the United States. And I do think that era is ending. I think we talked in the context of that book, Underground Empire, where it took a couple academics being like, gee, there's a lot of weaponized interdependence going on. And actually, if you think about it, if the United States pulls this lever, we could make this happen. And then the U.S. government being like, hey, you're right. I think we're getting into an era where we're going to see a lot more of that. The part of the reason why folks have been able to retain this illusion of a multipolar world or an even playing field is because the United States has scrupulously maintained that for more positive reasons, to sort of give other countries the self-respect and the ability to compete on some playing fields. I think there's less and less of that. In part, the polarization that's been so lamented in the United States has been the saving grace for a lot of folks, a lot of other actors in the world. The ability of the Republicans and the Democrats to largely fight about nonsense for the decades since the end of the Cold War had sort of allowed, at least until 2016, a lot of sort of free trade architecture that made sense during the Cold War that may not make so much sense anymore, just sort of persist completely unexamined. I'm not somebody who believes that the United States is going to just throw it all over and turn into North Korea or something along those lines. But I do think the trajectory is very clear from what Trump talked about and what Biden has done in some cases quite mercilessly, is that the United States is about to start exerting its power a lot less carefully, if that, which may seem, in the face of Gaza, in the face of the murder of Syria and our sanctions policy, that may seem ridiculous to say that we're really just at the start of the United States exerting its power. I think that not just in terms of political polarization between Republicans and Democrats, but the idea that U.S. business policy, U.S. corporations, multinationals have completely different priorities and approaches from the U.S. government. I think that era has been, that's persisted for a solid 30 years now. I think the relationship between multinationals and the United States government was a lot closer during the Cold War. And I think that closeness is going to be refostered in the coming decade. And I think that we're going to see a lot more exertion of U.S. power. And I think it would be incredibly irresponsible and dangerous and amoral, frankly, for the United States to exert more and more of that power. And that's to some extent what we're seeing during the Biden administration, while continuing to pretend we're in some kind of competition. Like, I think that to some extent, the United States has to pull back from the full free trade approach that we were in. Continued viability of the U.S. political system requires it, as the 2016 election showed. but we can do it intelligently, and we can do it with basic respect for other countries and the situation that other countries are in. That is not the way that either the Trump or Biden administrations have been approaching this. They've been like, oh, it's competition. We're competing with China. We're competing with India. We're competing with the European Union. And we're not. Like, we are the arbiters of the system. We have chosen to sort of take our hands off the wheel at the World Trade Organization. We've chosen now for a period of decades to take our hands off the wheel at the United Nations. But these are still our organizations to use if we choose to use them. And leaving aside those multilateral organizations, there's an incredible scope, as we've discussed already with the UFLPA, the JCPOA, for just U.S. laws to have a tremendous impact on the world. And if we continue to pretend while doing this, while just being this elementary school teacher, cheerfully kicking our way through classrooms full of 3-year-olds, while pretending that this is some kind of even competition, that's a very perverse, very sad, and damaged world. And I'm afraid that that's a world that we live in, and a world that's going to become more and more obvious with more and more Gazas and more Syrias in the years to come.
Are there any other paragraphs you like?
Gosh, geez, Rory, I never said that we'd ended quote from this Guardian article. So plausibly, everything I've said for the past half hour could have been a Tom
it was
Stevenson
one big
quote.
Giant quote.
Oh, geez, no. In fact, it was not.
I'll have to have the bed the whole way. The musical background for the whole thing, just looping.
Oh no, no, that was not. That was a paragraph of quote. I think this was another good quote from the article. If proponents of the end of the U.S. global order do not assert a decrease in the potency of instruments of American power, that is because there has been no such decrease. The share of global transactions conducted in dollars has been increasing, not declining. No other state can affect political outcomes in other countries the way the U.S. still does. Yeah, I mean, we talk so much about political interference in U.S. elections, whereas there is no election anywhere on the planet that does not experience a high level of U.S. interference. The reach of the contemporary United States is so great that it tends to blend into the background of daily events. In January 2019, the U.S. demanded that Germany ban the Iranian airline Mahan Air from landing on its territory. In September 2020, it sanctioned the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for refusing to drop investigations into American citizens. In February 2022, at U.S. request, Japan agreed to redirect liquefied fossil gas, which is critical to Japanese industry, to Europe in the event of a conflict with Russia over Ukraine. At the height of that conflict, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, found the time to visit Algiers to negotiate the reopening of a gas pipeline to Spain via Morocco. These were all quotidian events, unremarkable daily instances of humdrum imperial activity. The practical operation of the empire remains poorly understood, not despite its ubiquity, but because of it. So it's just so much like U.S. dominance, U.S. control is so much a part of daily life and daily political approaches that we don't even see it. We don't even see it.
But also things where they kind of America does what it wants. So although Ireland's very friendly to America, it's still a neutral country, but yet they still quite often land in Shannon Airport. It's a very important airport. It's basically like the first airport you'll get to in Europe, so it's important for refueling and emergency reasons. A very unique airport, and Ireland doesn't really like to be involved with the world's military. And America's a bit like, no, we're just going to land there anyway. I've heard stories. There was a podcast called the Blind Boy podcast where these Americans said they were, a company maybe going to invest in the nearby area. So he was trying to wine them and dine them and say it's such a lovely place. And then the woman took him aside and says, "I know what you're doing, but we're actually American Air Force, and we've been told that's our cover story because the locals don't like us landing here." But yeah, they just do it anyway, and that's just one tiny thing America is up to that most people don't even care about because it's just so common.
Yeah, and another great example was the case of the Chinese defense minister. Gosh, at the rate that China's going, this guy may already be may already have been disappeared or something. But there was this issue throughout 2022, I believe, and into 2023, where the United States wanted to have direct military-to-military relationship between China and the United States. This is common. This is sort of deconfliction.
Is this like red telephone stuff during the Cold War?
Very similar, but more detailed and more, the hotline between Russia and China, between the Soviets and Washington, D.C., that was put into place after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's sort of that's the example of it. But generally, especially I think in Syria, where the United States and Russia were bombing on behalf of antagonistic groups, it was really important that the Russian and U.S. Air Forces made very clear that they would not conflict with each other. Sometimes that would screw up, and U.S. Soldiers would just kill hundreds of Russian fighters. So it's important to keep in touch.
But they were mercenaries, so that's a loophole.
It's different. It's different. So obviously, it's very important as both China and the United States make the Taiwan Strait a huge part of their military, national, political agitation. It's very important that the Chinese and American militaries are speaking to each other so that we don't inadvertently end up with World War III. Since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, those relationships ended. And one of the things that China pointed out as the Biden administration kept trying to renew this relationship, the Biden administration, of course, I think the U.S. is much more interested in renewing this relationship because we're always doing these freedom of navigation things where we're constantly sending U.S. ships through Chinese territorial waters. So we want to make sure we're not going to inadvertently, run into any mines or anything. So the U.S. wanted to restore this, but the Chinese were like, "We'd love to restore this relationship, but do you remember that you sanctioned our defense minister?" There were I think there were sanctions against this guy personally before he was a defense minister, and not for something related to Xinjiang or the Uyghur issue, but because of CAATSA sanctions. Because under Donald Trump, the United States decided to start sanctioning any country that bought weapons from Russia. So we sanctioned Chinese folks for buying weapons from Russia. This is long before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And we just sort of forgotten that a highly ranked Chinese general was sanctioned by the United States. And the Chinese, I think quite reasonably, were like, "Yeah, we're not going to let you have these military-to-military relations that allow you to do your freedom of navigation shows while you're sanctioning our Minister of Defense." And then Biden and Xi met, and the military-military relations have been reestablished for the past couple of weeks now. And I don't think the United States lifted any sanctions. It just even like basic principles of self-respect by other countries are, negotiable. And that's the world we live in.
Have you any tips for a country to deal with America? Or are there some countries that once America has you in its crosshairs, there's very little you can do?
Yeah, I mean, once you've become a hate object for Washington, D.C., there's not a ton you can do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unfortunately, my advice, and I wrestle with this myself, my advice is don't play into their hands. And unfortunately, playing into their hands is resistance, is acting out in basic with basic self-respect. Like, I think the Iranians are. I think my playlist on YouTube is, Iran is more sinned against than sinning. I think that almost everything they've been doing for the past 20 years is basic self-defense, but I think they are unwise in the extent to which they allow that resistance to be violent. Because I think that every time they do something, it just plays into the U.S.'s hands. The greatest example would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I understand why they believed they had to do that, but they ended they had a whole bunch of interesting arguments, even after 2014. Interesting arguments, interesting positions from which to negotiate. And they threw it out the window on the altar of self-respect, on the altar of we're gonna, we're gonna prove that we're just, to some extent, really Russia, and I think China is guilty of this as well, though not yet to such a terrible extent, of sort of falling victim to the Pentagon propaganda that claims that they are more equal and more serious rivals than they actually are. Don't fall for Pentagon propaganda. Be aware that most of the money in U.S. politics is really invested in making the United States seem less powerful than it is, because that helps keep the...
That's really sad, the idea of some Chinese military underling running up to a superior saying, we were right, the Americans are scared of us, what we're doing is the right way and we're very strong, only for it to basically be lovely propaganda to, destroy you.
Yeah, and I mean, just look at what happened to the Russians. They really thought that they were just gonna roll over Ukraine. And you can make arguments that, they're going to get their land bridge or this, that, and the other thing, but at such an extreme cost compared to what they thought they were going to pay.
Also, the amazing thing wasn't it the day or two before America just went to Zelensky, we have Russia's invasion plan? Because Zelensky up until then kind of thought it was all a bluff and Russia was a lot more friendlier than, they were talking, they were talking tough, but weren't actually going to invade. And the CIA was like, nope, here you go. And then Zelensky suddenly panicked and then had to do his very best to defend his country. But it's just amazing how incredible America's spying abilities can be when they're just like, yep, top secret invasion plans. You might want these.
Yeah. It's, it is... The multidimensionality of U.S. power is something we try to emphasize a lot here, and that is just one more stick in the bundle of sticks that is U.S. empire. And I just wish we would.
It's also just to bring it back to airplanes in Ireland. I remember sometimes you notice generally when planes fly across Ireland, they're flying east-west or west-east. But there's one type of plane that kept flying north-south. And I heard rumors that these were like American spy planes. And I thought, this is nonsense. I don't buy this at all. So I seen one and went, that's one of them. Got out the airplane app, US Air Force. I think it was around when Joe Biden was coming. They were doing surveillance of the island. But it's quite common. If I just check what planes are about, it'll be US Navy or US Air Force. And they're just completely nobody flights that nobody would care about and completely unremarkable within the American military-industrial complex. And I'm just glad I'm not in one of the regions where I'm in America's crosshairs.
Yeah, it's not a good place to be. And it feels wrong to be like, oh, well, you should knuckle under. You should submit. But unfortunately, that's it's not. It's not, I guess to correct that, it's not a submission that you would be making, that Iran wouldn't be making like a new submission to U.S. power. Like the Russians aren't, like this submission happened decades ago. It's nobody's been, independent from U.S. power for decades. It's not. It's just an acknowledgement of reality, and the more violent the resistance, the more likely the United States is to come down like a ton of bricks. I mean, Al Qaeda essentially destroyed the Middle East, or rather, Al Qaeda gave the United States the excuse to destroy the Middle East over the past 20 years. Hamas is giving Israel and the United States the excuse to exterminate Gaza. So those would be great examples of what not to do. In the face of U.S. power.
Is there a paragraph you'd like to leave us with?
No, I think there wasn't. I mean, I think it's a great article. You should look into.
Check it out yourself.
Yeah, you should check it out yourself.
It's a long read, so it'll give you a very good idea if you would like to buy the book.
Indeed. I liked it enough that I did buy the book by Tom Stevenson. Even though he's a lefty, he's publishing with Verso. But I found the article quite persuasive. But yeah, I just wish that we would acknowledge reality a little bit more. I think that the world it's a very negative podcast, and I really do think that we're just a few turns of a few dials and knobs here away from utopia. And I think that if we just acknowledged how the world actually works, I think we'd be a lot closer to turning those knobs in the right directions. Because just this fantasy that there's some kind of great power competition going on here is incredibly damaging and has incredibly violent results that are utterly unnecessary, I believe.
Well, let's hope America chills out in the future and we could bring a new century of peace and prosperity.
Hell yeah. There we go. That's very positive. I like that.
Thank you very much for listening. You make it all possible, so we appreciate it a lot.
Yeah.
All the best.
All right. Cool beans.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.